So today we're talking about the story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus actually begins during the time of Joseph. So as you might recall, Diane was telling me this morning that she knew this story. As you might recall, Joseph is in prison in Egypt, and Pharaoh has a dream. And no one in his kingdom can interpret this dream. The dream is that Pharaoh is dreaming of he's walking beside the Nile. Seems like a nice dream. Any of you have like really vivid dreams? Oh, yes. I'm a total vivid dreamer. It's a curse and a blessing, isn't it? Yeah. The other day I woke up and I looked at Major Paul and I was like, I dreamed last night that I was forced to divorce you, and I did not like that very much. And Paul was like, I'm glad you didn't like that, dear. But anyway, Pharaoh has one of these vivid dreams, and he's walking beside the Nile when 7 fat cows come out of the Nile. And then 7 skinny cows come out of the Nile. And the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat cows. And Pharaoh calls all of his magicians, all of his court guys together, and he says, okay, best minds in Egypt, tell me what my dream means. And they're like, I don't know, eat more hamburgers? I got no idea. And this is overheard by one of Pharaoh's servants who was in prison with Joseph and had his dream interpreted. And so this guy says, hey, I know a guy. He's actually in your prison right now, and he interprets dreams. Why don't you call him, and maybe he can help you? And so Pharaoh calls Joseph, and Joseph says, well, Lord, I can't tell you what your dream means, but the Lord I serve can. And so Joseph goes on to say, there's going to be 7 great bumper crop years where we're going to have all the grain and all the food we could hope for, followed by 7 years of famine. And the only way we're going to make it through is if during the 7 good years, we save our grain and we make sure that we have saved up enough for the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh says, this sounds like a terrific idea. And so Pharaoh decides to put Joseph at that moment second in charge of the kingdom of Egypt, and says, you are going to be in charge of saving up the grain and making sure that we all survive the 7 years of famine. So in one day, Joseph goes from prison to second in charge, and as it happens, the famine comes to Egypt, and Egypt is the only country in the region that had grain to spare. And people began to pour into Egypt in search for food because it was a Middle East region catastrophe that was happening. And some of those people were Joseph's 11 brothers and his father Israel. And the Israelites were blessed in Egypt. They began to multiply, and they increased not just in numbers but in wealth. And this made the Egyptians very, very nervous. So we read in chapter 1, verse 8 of Exodus, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave this country. Over the next 400 years, life gets harder and harder and harder for the Israelites. Not only were they enslaved and forced into ever more difficult labors, but there's even a section in Exodus where we're told the midwives were commanded that if a baby boy was born, they were supposed to instantly kill it. Now, the midwives, they said, no, we can't do this. So they told a little white lie to Pharaoh. They were like, oh, you know, the Israelite women, they are so strong. By the time we get there, the babies are already born. There's nothing we can do. And so they saved them. But then the Egyptians, they were like, wait a second, we got to do something about this population boom. And so it came about that they said, every time you see a male baby Israelite, we're just going to throw him into the Nile River. We're just going to drown them. And that way we will control the population. Part of the reason that I share this history with you is that in the context of modern day slavery and human trafficking in our world, it's important for us to know that this did not start yesterday. The Israelites didn't go to sleep one night as free people and wake up the next day as slaves. The book of Exodus was 400 years in the making. Similarly, the economic and social forces in our world that result in the multi-billion-dollar industry of criminal industry that denies freedom across the globe to an estimated 49.6 million people that we refer to as modern-day slavery and human trafficking, that didn't start overnight. Evil in this world takes advantage of our complacency. Just as the Israelites forgot and ignored the land which was promised to them through their ancestor Abraham and made their homes in Egypt, just as the Egyptians justified the harsh treatment and enslavement of their neighbors, so too we live in a world where we casually accept the factors that lead to the exploitations of millions of people. We assume that it's just the way the world works, that there are millions of people who live in poverty around the world and long for a better life. We might find political instability and conflict to be tragic, but as long as Putin doesn't invade our country, or our government does not fall apart as it has in Haiti, then we just accept that there's always been war. And factors like this limit access to education and to opportunities for girls and people of color that we just often shrug off as, that's just the way things are. Or rather that the sin, rather than looking at these things as the sin that they actually are. We cannot ignore justice and sin in the world, not merely because it allows that very same sin to root and grow, but also because God doesn't ignore sin and injustice in the world. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, we read, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." What an incredible verse. I have seen. That God sees what happens in our world. God knows what happens in our world and longs to make his righteousness known, his justice known. Well, we might be complacent and even forget the injustices happening in our world. God hears the cries of the people, and God responds. God begins to prepare and call Moses to the task of leading his people out of slavery. Now, I guess that I'm supposing most of you, when you hear that statement, think like I think. I'm not a Moses. All right, God, I know you've called Amy Jo to something much smaller, right? I am not Moses material, right? But when we do that, and when we look closely at the story of Moses, we see the truth that for Moses to do his job, for Moses to be Moses, God surrounded him with a whole host of other characters and people who also had to follow God's call. While many of us in this room, probably most of us, will not be Moses. In fact, the Bible tells us no one has ever been like Moses or will ever be like Moses, right? God calls each and every one of us to take a part in his plan, to be part of bringing his justice into the world. Think about the people in Moses' life. There's Jochebed. That's Moses' mom. Now, what did she do? She concealed a little baby, probably for about 2 years. That's hard to do. She made sure that he was fed and taken care of, that people didn't see her little baby. And then when he got to be a toddler and was probably, you all who've had toddlers know they can be a little out of control, right? And it was no longer possible for her to conceal him any longer. She built a basket for him, made sure it was waterproof. And then she carefully set him in the Nile. I love how she followed the law, but in a sneaky way. She was like, well, Pharaoh said I had to throw my baby boy into the Nile. I just made sure he was in a basket first, right? and she placed him in the Nile. And then you have Miriam, Moses' older sister, probably a 7-year-old girl when they placed her little brother amongst the bulrushes in the Nile. And it was her job to follow that little basket, to make sure that it didn't tip over, to make sure that her baby brother was safe. And then we have Pharaoh's daughter, who finds this little basket. Now, God's in that story, right? Pharaoh's daughter just happens to say, today I think I'll take a bath, right? And then she just happens to find this basket that just happened, right? God's there. And as it floats past, she finds this basket, and she knows, because she says, oh, it's a Hebrew baby boy. She knows what's in that basket. She knows her own father has said, this little guy needs to get drowned. And yet, what does she say? I will adopt him into my household. Then you have Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who, when Moses has to flee Egypt, employs Moses. We know Jethro gives Moses good advice throughout his leadership of the Israelite people. We even have Zipporah, Moses' wife, who saves Moses from being struck down by God as he travels to Egypt. There's Aaron, Moses' brother and priest, who was the mouthpiece for Moses. And Moses didn't accomplish his mission alone. And more to the point, God never intended for Moses to accomplish that mission alone. In our response to human trafficking and modern-day slavery, there are many parts to play. As a movement, the Salvation Army dedicates a whole week to prayer. And today, we play a very important part in that as we pray together. And while very few people can be Moses, there are many people who are needed to continue to pray, to support, to spread awareness, to be vigilant, to speak out on issues that contribute to human trafficking. There cannot be a Moses without all of those other players. But just because God has called us and we know that this work is God's work, it doesn't mean that this work will be easy. When Moses first came to Pharaoh, Pharaoh rejects them and decides to make life even more difficult for the Israelites. This comes from that Bible verse that Major Paul read. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God, make the work harder for the people so that they will keep working and pay no attention to their lies. I am not a brick maker. I know you're all very surprised by that. But I have never made bricks, but I did look up some brick making facts, and straw makes bricks, makes them stronger. Some scientists say as much as 3 times stronger bricks are with straw. Straw obviously makes bricks lighter because straw is lighter than clay. Straw helps to reduce the amount of clay that is needed to make the bricks. And when you introduce straw into your bricks, it makes the bricks dry more evenly, and therefore it makes them stronger in the end. Making bricks without straw often refers to a task which must be done without all the resources. And unfortunately, when we combat modern-day slavery and human trafficking, it also seems like a task that we must undertake with very few resources. It often feels like the criminal networks are 2 steps ahead of those of us who are working against the problem. Experts in AI estimate that online scammers have access to technology that is 2 years more advanced than what most companies have access to. Just about a month ago, I attended virtually the Asia Regional Anti-Trafficking Symposium. I attended online. And one of the classes I went to was a class about online scamming, where hundreds of thousands of people are forced to scam people for 20 hours a day. And what they're targeting is they're targeting young people who know English and know computers. So educated, smart young people, like some of the young people we know, right? And they're targeting these people, and it's almost impossible to tell whether the difference between a real job offer and one of these scam job offers. And what will happen is they'll say to these people, hey, come, we'll give you a free vacation and you can see our company. And they put them up in a nice hotel and they feed them. And then one day they're like, oh, and as part of your special tour, we're going to give you a tour boat ride. And they'll put them in a boat and they'll end up on the other side of the river where they don't have the right visa. And they'll say, now you're in trouble. You're in this country illegally. And they will literally lock them up in compounds with armed guards and force them into scamming. And they say that these folks have access to technology that is far beyond what we have commercially accessible. That they can look at their computer and they can make their computer sound like anyone from around the world. And they can make their face look like anyone from around the world so that they can scam people from all around the world. And I hear those things and I go, what am I supposed to do, right? I don't, Lord, I don't have all of these resources. I can barely use AI on my computer, like just with the phone says, do you want to say this instead of this? Sure. What am I supposed to do? And what we see, and when we see that Moses, as we see the facts and figures related to human trafficking, it's disheartening. It feels a lot like the back-breaking work of making bricks without straw. And so for every person that is repatriated and rescued, we know that there are millions left. And the traffickers feel unstoppable. And so they echo Pharaoh, who said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord and will not let them go. Yet Moses was undaunted. We read in verse 22, what does Moses do? Moses returned to the Lord. Why, Lord, have you brought trouble to these people? Is this why you sent me? And in the next chapter, God answers. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with my outstretched arm. You see, the problem of modern-day slavery forces us to turn to the Lord. It forces us to ask hard questions. It forces us to seek answers. And when we do this, our focus turns from any small thing that we might do as individuals to the great things that God can accomplish. And we trust that God has a plan for every victim. We trust God has a plan for every survivor. We trust that God has a plan for their families. And we trust that God even has a plan for those creating demand and those who are exploiting and trafficking others. And we fight for their freedom until every person is free.
When I fear my faith will fail, Christ will hold